Okay, as you know, F700 is a brand new F tag as a result of the revisions that were made to the OBRA F tags starting last year. And F700 speaks to what the definition is of bed rails and all the other regulatory requirements that are now included with regard to bed rails. My IPMG risk management team, we've been talking about the inherent risks associated with bed rails, side rails, whatever you want to call them, for it seems like over a decade. And here now, some of our risk management concerns are included in this new, relatively new regulatory language. So let's start with the definition of what the F tag is referring to make sure that we start out all on the same page. As my consultants and I have gone out in the field to various homes, there seems to be some misunderstanding about what's all included in terms of what's covered under this new F tag. So let's get on the same page with that. The regulatory language refers to bed rails, and if you look at the bottom of this slide, I'm going to ask that we, moving forward, call them bed attachments. I think when we use the word bed rails, people automatically think of exclusively, side rails, when in fact the definition includes things like grab bars, assist bars, transfer, halos. So it's more than what's included here, and what's included under the regulatory compliance requirements now is bigger than side rails. It includes these other attachments. So let's, moving forward for our purposes today, call these bed attachments. So under the definition, it's these bed attachments are metal or rigid plastic bars that somehow attach to the bed. Sometimes they're designed by the manufacturer as part of the bed, coming with the bed, or they can be those bed attachments that are subsequently purchased separate from the bed, installed by the facility. The definition speaks to a variety of types, a variety of shapes. Like I said, it could be the halo shape, could be the transfer bar type of attachment, a variety of lengths. Yes, in fact, it includes the teeny weeny rail that's only at the head of the bed. It could be a quarter length, half length, full length. All of it counts. Some facilities are still under the impression that the very, very short rails that come down from the headboard maybe aren't included in this. Everything is included in these regulatory requirements. A variety of attachment points. So sometimes they extend from the headboard a quarter of the way, a half of the way. If you have side rails that they may be the length of a quarter rail or the length of a half rail, but they attach actually in the middle of the bed, that counts, and that certainly, that positioning of the rail may also require that you look into whether in fact that type of rail bed attachment causes a restraining effect on the resident. That's what I mean by attachment points. Some facilities have an upper rail and a lower rail that create a space in between when they're raised. Those have particular regulatory compliance requirements at another government level, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But certainly don't forget and don't exclude the use of grab bars and assist bars in the processes that we're going to be talking about going forward. Okay, let's review some regulatory language. There are two components, and the second component has a bunch of core principles. The first component is that the facility must attempt to use appropriate alternatives to bed attachments prior to installing a bed attachment. We have to try other kinds of things before we go to contemplation of a bed attachment. Secondly, If a bed attachment is used, if it's determined that a bed attachment is the best approach after we've tried other alternatives, or at least contemplated other alternatives, the facility must ensure the correct installation, use, and maintenance of the bed attachment. The core components of that include assessing the resident for risk of entrapment prior to the installation of the bed attachment assessment. As a result of the assessment process and the determination of whether or not to proceed to actual installation and use, we need to review the risks and benefits with the resident or the resident's representative and obtain an informed consent. We need to ensure the bed's dimensions are appropriate for the resident's size and weight, and we need to follow the manufacturer's recommendations and specifications for installing or maintaining the bed attachment. Okay, so now we know what we're supposed to do, and how do we get it done? My recommendation is that upon admission, we start with the assumption that bed attachments will not be used, and work up from there. So that means either we start with a bed that is free from any bed attachments to start with, so there's no confusion on the staff's part as to whether they should raise or lower a bed rail, or they should be utilizing a halo. If the bed has nothing to start with, there's no confusion. If that's not feasible based upon the type of railing or attachment, whether it's an functionally integral part of the bed's construction, I think it's important to think about how we can ensure through education or some actual physical means of making the bed attachment unavailable until we decide it needs to be available, either by tying it off, signage, or some other approach that ensures that staff will not be confused in terms of the fact that the bed attachment may be present, but its use has not been authorized. So upon admission, start with the assumption that the bed attachment will not be used, and then we go on our usual way of conducting all kinds of routine assessments that we currently do to assess the resident's abilities and their limitations. So we will do our routine transfer assessment. We will evaluate the resident's ability to do bed mobility in all its various forms, what the resident's cognition level is, what their balance and trunk control is, the degree of fall risk, et cetera, et cetera. You all have those assessments. A PS and an aside here, though, however, the regulatory language we already discussed requires us to evaluate the appropriateness of the bed given the resident's height and weight. So it does not dictate where we have to document that we've evaluated this appropriateness. However, we need to make sure that it's clear that we've done so. So I would recommend that we evaluate for each facility, evaluate where that information is best stored, determined by whom and stored, like maybe in your bed mobility current assessment, you may want to talk about the appropriateness of the bed. But clearly, it needs to be reflected that you did that function. So we've done all these assessments. From the admission assessments, we may have information that the resident would benefit from some kind of support in an area that's appropriate for use of a bed attachment. What are the appropriate uses of a bed attachment? Clearly, bed mobility. There are lots of residents out there for whom we believe that some form of bed attachment, whether it's a side rail or a halo or some other kind of device, would facilitate the resident's ability to move more independently in bed. Or the intermittent use of one of those devices would assist the staff in providing care to the resident if the resident was able to hold on to something that maintained that, let's say, their side lying position. So that's definitely an appropriate use for bed attachment, bed mobility. Transfer, another appropriate use of a bed attachment, like a halo or a transfer bar or something like that, that enables the resident to either independently or participate in the transfer activity. Bed attachments can also assist residents in recognizing the spatial limits of the bed. Again, from the admission process, from the admission assessment, would the resident appear to benefit from some form of support in any of the above areas? Now, let's bear in mind that bed attachments, side rails, halos, etc., are really not appropriate to use to prevent intentional exiting from the bed. A half a side rail is really not the most effective means to keep someone in their bed who is trying to get out, who is unsafe to exit independently. A full side rail or a center positioned half side rail could restrain the resident in bed, but we know, before we even go any further with this morning's talk, that those kinds of uses of side rails and other attachments have tremendous risk associated with it. So if we can agree that at least the three areas that we've talked about are the appropriate uses of a bed attachment, and going forward, we're not going to be addressing the use of the bed attachment in terms of keeping the resident in the bed. For example, to avoid independent ambulation, unassisted self-transfer, or as a means to prevent a fall. So clearly, if you recall, the very first component of the regulatory language was we need to contemplate possible alternatives to try prior to the use of the bed attachment. So we've determined through our normal assessment process that the resident may benefit in one of those three areas may benefit from assistance in the three areas that we talked about. So depending on what area, whether it's bed mobility or transfer or some kind of spatial assistance for the limit, to identify the limit of the bed, these are some alternatives that facilities may try prior to the installation of the bed attachment. So, for example, we could determine or adjust the optimal resident-specific bed height to facilitate transfer. We could provide restorative care to enhance the resident's ability to transfer, stand, walk, etc. We could provide periodic assisted toileting when in bed to minimize the resident's attempts at self-transfer. We could instead of the resident using some other kind of device, we could provide frequent monitoring and anticipate their needs, visual and verbal reminders to use a call light when appropriate, a raised edge mattress for spatial recognition of the limits of the mattress. A trapeze is another alternative to enhancing more independent bed mobility versus the use of the bed attachment. Some or all of these alternatives may be appropriate to attempt prior to the installation of the bed attachment, depending on the resident, depending how significant their needs are. And it's important to document what you do choose to attempt in the care plan, so that there's evidence that you've done, that you've complied with the first component of the regulatory language. If these alternatives or others that you've come up with are not successful, or they're not sufficient, they help a little but not enough, they help the resident become somewhat more independent, but not as fully independent as they or we would like for them to achieve, or for some reason are not clinically indicated for that particular resident, now we're at the point of performing a bed attachment assessment. According to the regulatory language, this assessment should include alternative interventions that were considered, implemented, and why they weren't successful or successful enough, and we just reviewed that. What the resident is doing or experiencing that leads us to consideration of a bed attachment. What are the causal or contributing factors, including medical symptoms, conditions, and behaviors that lead us to contemplate a bed attachment? How the bed attachment would enhance the resident's ability to perform among the three categories that we talked about: bed mobility transfer or spatial recognition. The bed attachment assessment needs to include resident-specific risk factors. And then finally, a conclusion and recommendation section where we discuss the benefits versus the risks, and if recommended, what is the intended purpose, what is the time period we're going to be using them for, and any other resident-specific considerations, and we'll get to that. We have redesigned our existing side rail assessment that has been posted on the portal to a bed attachment assessment template that incorporates the components that are required in this new regulatory language. So what we're going through now in the next couple of slides are portions of that revised assessment, which you will be able to find on the portal as we speak. So please feel free to download this assessment, use a paper version that you can upload into your electronic medical record system, and or make adjustments to your existing assessment form so that you're sure that it includes all of the required components. So here we are. This is the heading of the top portion of the assessment that is available on the portal, where it asks us to identify how the bed attachment would enhance the resident's ability, whether it's in the various components of bed mobility, turning side to side, moving up and down in the bed. Now, it may do a lot of these things, so check off whatever is appropriate. Hold a position during self-care, assume or maintain a sitting position. The bed attachment may also facilitate the resident's ability to transfer more independently or have a greater degree of participation or not. This section is for you to check off whatever applies to the specific resident in ways that through assessment and trying other alternatives you've come to believe in terms of enhancing the resident's ability. Entering the bed, exiting the bed, somehow in concert with a mechanical lift transfer, or in terms of recognizing the bed's limits. This upper portion of the assessment form also gives us an opportunity to identify the medical symptom or condition that would be addressed by the use of the bed attachment. Let's say the resident has hemiparesis and isn't able to move sufficiently independently in bed or turn in a particular direction, and the use of a halo, for example, would facilitate that. The second portion, the mid portion of the assessment, speaks to the alternative interventions that were considered and or implemented. And this is an opportunity, in addition to the care plan, where the facility can verify that they did attempt alternatives prior to the contemplation of a bed attachment. So maybe we adjusted the resident's bed height and we did all the things that we talked about before. We tried a trapeze, but the resident doesn't have the upper body strength to sufficiently make use of the trapeze. And that's why this alternative was not successful or was insufficient. And now we're moving on to something that we believe would enhance the resident's independence even more than the trapeze. Here are samples of common resident risk factors. Certainly there's opportunities for additional ones, and there's a space for you to elaborate on any additional resident-specific comments that may be necessary. One of the risk factors, and I put this one front and center, is because it should be the one risk factor that absolutely disqualifies the resident from using a bed attachment, and that's history of injury related to side rail or bed assistive device use. If we, from a risk management perspective, if we've had, a significant injury or event related to a side rail, why would we set ourselves and the residents up for another one? Hemiparesis and paraplegia could be a reason to use it. It also could be a significant risk factor in that a resident who has an unusable side or a weak side could be caught between a roll between a mattress and a side rail, get their limb through a side rail potentially and create some significant injury. Do they have decreased safety awareness related to dementia? Would they try to climb over a side rail, around a side rail, get stuck in between side rails? The resident may be cognitively intact but unwilling to accept their limitations, and we know those residents can get into as much trouble as a dementia resident when they try to take actions that exceed their abilities. History of self-transfer attempts when the resident is unable to do so safely. History of falls. History of unintentional falling or rolling out of bed. Restless thrashing in bed in terms of potential injuries if their limbs were to come in contact with a bed attachment. Difficulty with balance or poor trunk control if they got themselves into a certain position and were unable to right themselves. Could that lead to entrapment? Again, is their height or weight or the dimensions of their head or limbs different enough to make it significant? So if the resident is particularly short, very thin, could their limbs potentially go through the space in a side rail that is normally considered within the guidelines? But given this resident's petite frame, it puts them at risk even with a 4 3/8 inch space. Medications that require safety precautions. Is the resident visually challenged? And certainly there are other risk factors. Now, I have to say, these are not, the yeses are not weighted. They're not, this form is not about adding up the points and coming to a decision, because although the resident may have one or a number of these risk factors, based upon your intended use of the bed attachment and what benefit you're trying to achieve, that particular risk may not be relevant to the purpose or the type of bed attachment you're intending to use, or for the period of time. So let's talk about that for a moment. I know everyone wants to have a let me add up the score, but sometimes that we just have to think about stuff. So this is the important section where we come to a conclusion based upon the risks and benefits and our opportunity to justify our decision. If there are too many risk factors that relate specifically to the reason we want to use it, the bed attachment, then we have to decide not to use it. If the resident could benefit from a transfer, a halo, to participate more fully in staff-assisted transfer, but the resident is a high fall risk who has an extensive history of attempts at self-transfer, does the availability of a halo prompt the resident or facilitate the resident's attempts to self-transfer? Here we're leaving this transfer bar on their bed. We want them to be able to use it when we're present, but we don't want them to use it when we're not present, and yet there it is, it's present. So is the risk of fall, is the history of attempts at self-transfer more of a risk than the benefit of periodically having the resident participate in staff-assisted transfer. That's a decision the facility has to make. There may be a benefit to having the side rail up so that during staff care, so that the resident can maintain a sideline position. However, the resident would be at risk, based on the risk factors you've identified, if the side rail was up all the time when they were in bed. So is there some way to ensure that we're only utilizing the side rail during care episodes, and that we can be confident that the side rail, which presents a risk otherwise, would not be up, would not be present during non-care times when the resident's napping or sleeping at night? That conversation, that thought process needs to be included in this discussion of risks and benefits, because we may decide that we want the side rail or the halo up during care episodes, but not otherwise. How are we going to make sure that we can pull that off safely? If recommended, if we decide that the benefits under whatever circumstances outweigh the risks, then what is the indication for use? Bed mobility, transfer, spatial recognition, something else? What type of bed attachment are we going to be using? There's an opportunity to fill in that blank. How many are we going to be using? 1 or 2? Are there special instructions, like I just mentioned? Quarter side rail up on left side only during care episodes. And then an opportunity for signature and date by the person who's completing the form. If a bed attachment is recommended as a result of doing the comprehensive assessment, then we have to conduct a resident-specific bed attachment safety assessment. And I want to draw your attention to several things. If the facility has side rails that they purchased separately and were not provided with the bed by the manufacturer, then it's important before installation to determine that the side rails are compatible with the bed frame. It's also important to do a zone safety assessment, and I will refer you again to the portal where we will be or have uploaded several guidances that should be extremely helpful. One of them is the clinical guidance assessment of bed rails, and the other one is that's from the FDA. There's another FDA document that's uploaded on the portal that explains the zones, zone safety, the measurements for different for the space considered safe. For example, with zone 1, within the rail, space not to exceed 4 3/4 inches, between the rails, things like that. So again, resident-specific bed attachment safety assessment, zones 1 through 7. Sometimes even, and I emphasize resident-specific, because even when bed rails are properly designed to reduce the risk of entrapment or falls, and they are compatible with the bed and mattress and are used appropriately, they can still represent a hazard to certain individuals. For example, as I had mentioned earlier, the extremely thin resident may require even less space within the rail than the recommended 4 3/4 inches, or the facility has to do some other kind of mitigation, like a side rail cover, to ensure that the thin-limbed resident will not be injured by getting their limb, head, or neck in that space. The use of specialty air-filled mattresses may also create temporary gaps or ravines, when the resident rolls to the side of the mattress, and therefore what looks like a well-fitting mattress upon visual inspection, when the resident's actually in the bed and rolls, could be unsafe, and they could slide potentially into this temporary gap Certain mattresses contract and expand, and if they're in that valley, when the mattress expands, they could become entrapped. So again, resident-specific bed attachments, a safety assessment. If the resident isn't in an air-filled mattress and you're in the facility's customary, pressure relieving mattress, that may not be an issue. However, we have to make sure. And after this, it is also feasible that this portion is not specifically a nursing function. It could be a maintenance department function, to be, stored in their documentation, if the facility feels that to be appropriate. If the bed attachment is still recommended, again, what actions will be taken to remediate any resident-specific risks that may still exist? So sheepskin, for example, or some kind of cushioning on a side rail if the resident has periodic behaviors that include combativeness and thrashing their arms around, and yet that risk did not apparently outweigh the benefit of having the side rail for whatever reason. If the resident is thin, are we putting a side rail cover over it to make sure that limbs don't become engaged? If the resident benefits from periodic side rail raising during care episodes only, how are we going to ensure or trigger that the side rail is lowered during periods of no care? As you recall, there's a requirement for informed consent prior to the installation of and use of the bed attachment. And the information that has to be provided to the resident or family is a discussion of the assessed medical needs that would be addressed by use of the bed attachment, which we've already done by virtue of the bed attachment assessment. The resident's benefits from the use of the bed attachment and the likelihood of these benefits. So we do believe that they could benefit in the area of bed mobility, but if in fact the resident has, what's the degree of the benefit? What's the likelihood that they'll participate in bed mobility? What's their motivation? A discussion of the resident's risks from the use of the bed attachments and how we're going to address them. And a review of what you've tried prior to contemplation of the bed attachment and why they weren't successful, why they didn't work. There is a revised informed consent also available on the portal that incorporates language and components that appear now in this new regulation, F700. So based upon comprehensive assessment of resident X, the facility has determined that the resident would benefit from the use of bed attachments or some form of side rail. Indicate the type and the number to address what medical symptom for the purpose of check what applies, and a place for you to fill in what previous alternatives have already been attempted. Potential risks of bed attachments, these speak to generic risks up and including death, which families need to know about. We can't shy away from the potential for the serious consequences of bed entrapment. And then what the facility is going to be doing to minimize the potential for risks for those above generic kinds of risks. And you can discuss that you've assessed the resident specifically, you do a safety assessment of the specific bed and bed attachment, you've got routine preventative maintenance going on, and what else, if anything, you may do to minimize the risks for that particular resident, and then you have them signed. Often families have misconceptions about the benefits of bed attachment usage, and they see the side rails up on beds in hospitals all the time. If your facility has used side rails frequently on almost everyone in the past, this is going to be a change for them. Proactive education is essential to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands why we're taking the actions that we're taking. In the MD order and in the care plan, it's important. You should be including the type of bed attachment, side rail, halo, transfer bar, the length, number, side of the bed, and other details. Circumstances for use, when in bed, when receiving care in bed, to maintain side lying position, down at all other times, whatever the specifics are should be included in the care plan. And any information that your CNAs need to have to perform correctly. During hours of sleep, this is another example, during hours of sleep, use a rail cover at all times. It's possible that you are going to be intending to use the bed attachment for a very limited period of time. The residents in a bed mobility program or some kind of restorative process to improve their strength and their coordination during transfer, and they need the transfer bar now and for an anticipated 2-week period until they're able to do without it. So those kinds of things could be in the care plan as well. Okay, some miscellaneous information, opinion, and comment. It's important to remember that side rails, bed rails, and other kinds of bed attachments are not illegal. They're not forbidden. This is this regulatory language is intended to increase resident safety and to make sure that when we use these devices, they're used based upon resident-specific assessment and not simply because we always have used them. That being said, please resist the trend toward blanket policy of no side rails. And that does not mean that I endorse the use of side rails and bed attachments, because as I said earlier, we've been talking about only use it when it's appropriate, recognize the inherent risks of side rails and bed attachments. Don't take any side rail for granted. So none of us are encouraging the use of side rails, but don't err on the other side of, okay, we're not going to use any kind of bed attachment at all, because some residents will absolutely benefit from them. And the benefits clearly outweigh the risks for many residents. So let's provide what they need to be as independent as possible based upon a comprehensive assessment. As clear as these new regulations are regarding prudent use of the side rails, surveyors also are looking for attention to resident need and what facilitates their independence. A facility that I worked with decided that because of the new regulations, they were going to implement a no side rail, no bed attachment policy, universal. And in one afternoon, they removed all the side rails from all the beds in all the rooms for all the residents, and had really no plan for what they were going to substitute to ensure that residents' needs were met and that independence was maintained. Needless to say, there was a complaint visit shortly thereafter, and the facility received multiple F tags related to this blanket policy. Decisions should be based upon resident-specific needs, and whether it's a bed attachment, an alarm, a restraint, we attempt to use other alternatives and the least restrictive approach until we need to use something that meets the resident need, and then we have to assess and document appropriately. Again, educating families about appropriate or inappropriate indications for the use of bed attachments, and we need to educate our staff on this. If we're assessing that the resident benefits from a half side rail for on one side to facilitate more independent bed mobility, and the CNA says to the family and the surveyor, oh yeah, that side rail is up there to keep the resident in bed so they don't fall, that's clearly a disconnect. It's a disconnect with regard to the staff's understanding of why we're using something, clearly contradicts what our assessment says. The family's confused and the surveyor is questioning, what we're trying to pull off here. So it's important that everyone is on the same page and that we're all educated as to the appropriate versus the inappropriate indications for use of bed attachments. We need to monitor the use of bed attachments. We need to look out for bed attachment creep. And by that, I mean, I am in the bed today. I have been completely assessed. I benefit. My benefits outweigh my risks for the use of my particular bed attachment, and tomorrow I go home. And the next day, someone else is admitted into that same bed. What happened to the bed attachments? Are they still there? Have we implemented the appropriate process of removing all the bed attachments and starting from scratch, as we should be, to ensure that all of a sudden people who don't need a bed attachment or are too risky to have one, all of a sudden have one? We really need to monitor creep. And lastly, we need to ensure that we have a preventative maintenance schedule that monitors the integrity of the side rail or bed attachment, other type of bed attachment, that continues to monitor the zone safety in a resident-specific way, and that needs to be done routinely and documented and maintained so that we have it to demonstrate. Before we move on to the next portion of our conversation this morning, are there any questions?
You can type the questions into the chat function, and we can answer them verbally. You can also use the questions portion to ask a question as well.
Okay, Jennifer has asked, what is a halo? A halo is a bed attachment that is attached to the bed frame. It's a straight vertical bar that then has a circle, a metal circle on it that is used for transfer, or sometimes used for bed mobility. It doesn't take up, I guess the halo is about 12 to 16, 18 inches in diameter. And it may even be a manufacturer name, like we use Hoyer for full body, mechanical lift, but halo is essentially a transfer attachment. I'll pause for a moment, waiting to see if anybody is typing.
Make that a little bigger. Well, that's a big question.
That's the halo question.
I'm trying to.
When should the bed attachment assessment be done? Time frame upon admission, frequency thereafter, and by whom? Some facilities seem to be doing the bed attachment assessment automatically upon admission. My recommendation is that you do other assessments, like your bed mobility transfer, fall risk, all your other admission assessments, as you normally do. See if there's any resident need that surfaces as a result of all of those assessments, whether it's need for an assistance with bed mobility, need for assistance with transfer in and out of bed, or any of the other things that we talked about, and then look for ways to address that need or meet that need, provide that assistance by one of the other alternatives, not a bed attachment yet. Because we have to try other stuff before we jump to the bed attachment. So I think if we do the bed attachment automatically on everybody, it's going to indicate that they could benefit from one, and we haven't even given ourselves a chance to try another alternative. So my recommendation is not to do it automatically, to do all of our other assessments, see if there's an actual need for some kind of alternative, try an alternative. If the alternative isn't successful or insufficient, then do the bed attachment assessment. Who should do it? I'm going to be somebody's enemy if I answer that question. I think my personal opinion is that the bed attachment assessment is clinical, so I believe that clinical people should be doing it. I think the bed attachment safety assessment that has to do with zones and measuring side rails and what have you, the lion's share of that could certainly be done at a facility management or maintenance level with input from clinical, if in the event that they have some kind of specialty mattress or other considerations. Frequency, you asked about frequency. If in fact the bed attachment assessment determination is to use one, depending on the time frame, it is intended to be used. So let's say it's temporary. You decide that somebody's in rehab and they need this transfer bar attached to their bed for a short period of time. Then I would reassess when that short period of time is over. Other than that, if we're expecting that the resident will need it for a longer period of time, then I would do it with your quarterly reassessments, because it's really important to reevaluate the risk factors. If anything has changed with the resident's clinical condition, behavior, what have you, it's important to validate whether or not the benefits still outweigh the risks.
I'm talking about trapeze.
Yeah. Okay. What about overhead trapeze? It's an alternative. It's not a bed attachment in the way that a side rail or bar, other kind of transfer bar or whatever is attached to the bed. It doesn't represent an entrapment risk. So a trapeze is part of an alternative to a bed attachment.
Are there any other questions?
Type away. Okay. Okay. As part of the talk, I said that I included in the description of the webinar that I wanted to make some miscellaneous comments about alarms based upon, not solely based upon, but as a result of hearing Connie Jensen speak fairly recently on the topic, briefly on the topic, and I thought, of course, I would add some of my own 2 cents in also. Miscellaneous musings. Also wanted to point out that alarms in and of themselves are not illegal. There appears to be a widespread trend toward blanket policies of no alarms. And guess what? I have the same comments about blanket policy here that I did about side rails and other bed attachments. And what I mean about resisting the trend is not that we're not supportive of facilities looking for other alternatives to alarm use, because alarms have downsides, as we all know. But again, resist the trend toward the blanket policy, not an alarm-free zone. You want to strive to look for other kinds of alternatives and look for root cause and interventions that are really meaningful with regard to the resident's risky behavior. But there is no one-size-fits-all in the area of fall prevention, and there may be times, brief or extended, that the facility may benefit from the use of alarms in attempting to maintain the resident fall-free. If you say no alarms, you may be cutting yourself off from a device that assists you and buys some time with regard to evaluating the resident's behavioral trends in alarm use that could help you in identifying the root cause. Again, just like with, that's why I wanted to raise alarms along with side rails, decisions about alarm usage should be based upon resident-specific assessment and needs. You can certainly assess and document whether or not the alarm restrains the resident. I haven't, although I've heard stories, I've heard urban legends about residents for whom the sound of the alarm causes them to feel restrained. They're afraid to move in their wheelchair, and I totally appreciate that. However, I have never met that resident. In the facilities that we go to, those that are using alarms, residents set off alarms 10 times a day. They don't appear to be restrained by anticipating the sound of the alarm. So if we document that observation, then we're not running the same kind of risk in terms of a surveyor questioning whether the resident is actually being restrained by the alarm. And that's really the issue there. When you contemplate removing an alarm from a resident, look beyond whether or not the resident has fallen in a 2 weeks, month, 2 month, 3 month period. It's great that they haven't fallen, but a more meaningful indicator of whether the alarm is helpful or not is whether or not they've set off the alarm, whether or not they've engaged in the risky behavior. If they haven't fallen, it just means that the staff has gotten there in time. But if they're setting off the alarm 10 times a day, they're still engaging in risky behavior 10 times during the day, and we haven't figured out why they're doing that. So I suggest that as you contemplate whether or not the alarm is a meaningful adjunct and intervention among the number of fall prevention interventions you're using, use the alarm sounding pattern to help you identify the root cause of the risky behavior. And then develop interventions that will reduce the risky behavior, which thereby reduces the need for the alarm. If we take the alarm away without knowing what we should be specifically substituting to prevent risky behavior, we're not going to be preventing the risky behavior. So if Joe sets off the alarm 5 times during an activity, what is Joe trying to tell us? What need is Joe trying to meet? Fortunately, there are staff right there who get to Joe, tell him to sit down. He's safe for 5 minutes. Joe stands up again. The alarm goes off. The alarm is identifying the fact that Joe is engaging in risky behavior. It's telling us when, where, and under what circumstances Joe is engaging in risky behavior. Let's use that information to figure out more accurately what is going on with Joe, what Joe is trying to tell us, what Joe is trying to accomplish. Does he have to go to the bathroom? Do his knees hurt? Does he just need to get up and move because he's anxious? Is the activity boring? Is the activity too loud? Let's try to identify what Joe is trying to tell us. More often than not, the longer a resident has the alarm, the more it becomes a substitute call light. The resident is not able to use the call light for whatever cognitive impairment, and when they're trying to get up and meet a need, and the alarm goes off, it's the same as if you or I was setting off the call light to say we need to go to the restroom. But that resident can't do that. The alarm is doing it for them. If we take the alarm away without knowing that they engage in that type of behavior, we're not preventing the next fall. Some residents may need an alarm for whatever time period, short or long, because we haven't gotten there yet, because we haven't figured out what their pattern is. We haven't identified the root cause. If we're concerned about the potential for the sound restraining the resident or agitating the resident when it goes off, or agitating others, or staff becoming insensitive to the sound of alarm, there are lots of other products out there. There are silent alarms that go to a pager or go to the nursing station. There are motion detectors on bathrooms and room doors, etc. So there are other alternatives to the disruptive sound of the alarm for those people for whom we've decided, based on resident-specific assessment, that we need more help. We need more tracking and trending to figure out what they're trying to accomplish, and we haven't done that yet. Does anybody have any questions about my miscellaneous alarm musings? I'd be happy to entertain them, so type away. Or if someone has come up with thought of a question to ask about bed attachments, now's the time. All right, everybody, if a question comes to you after the webinar is officially closed, please feel free to contact me at any time via email, phone call, give me a jingle. I'd be happy to talk with you. Thank you so much for joining me this morning in this conversation. The recording of the webinar will be posted as quickly as possible to the portal if for those staff who weren't able to attend this morning. And we look forward to the next time we spend time together. Thanks again.